Hello, everyone. Welcome to this conversation on minorities and mass incarceration. In this conversation, we're going to look at mass incarceration disparities. We're going to look at the consequences of mass incarceration. We're going to look at the path forward. That will include a conversation of a biblical view of just policing, some of the different Christian perspectives on incarceration that exist out there, and then some suggested reforms. So I want to begin this conversation with this question: why mass incarceration? Why does America incarcerate at a higher level than any other country in the world? And why is it an issue with regard to race? In a country like ours, where we have a diverse society, but we do have a majority white um, population, and we have minorities, why would race be an issue in incarceration on any level? Should we expect that to be the case? Should we expect minority races in any country to be incarcerated at a higher level than the majority race? Why mass incarceration, and why is it a racial issue? Barbara Salter McNeil said in her book Becoming Brave, although rates of drug use and selling are comparable across racial lines, people of color are far more likely to be stopped, searched, arrested, prosecuted, convicted, and incarcerated for drug law violations than are whites. Higher arrest and incarceration rates for African Americans and Latinos are not reflective of a higher prevalence of drug use or sales in these communities, but rather reflect a law enforcement focus on urban areas, on low-income communities, and on communities of color, as well as inequitable treatment by the criminal justice system. John Ehrlichman, who was an aide to President Nixon, paints an actually more sinister um, portrait of why this is the case, what Barbara McNeil said is the case. He said, again, he was an aide to President Richard Nixon, and much of the law and order um, politics and policies come from the Nixon administration in the 70s, from the Reagan administration in the 80s, and even going forward into the more recent administrations. Uh, this is what Ehrlichman said. The Nixon campaign in 1968 and Nixon White House after that had two enemies, the anti-war left and black people. We knew we couldn't make it illegal to be either against the war or against black people. But by getting the public to associate the hippies with marijuana and blacks with heroin, and then criminalizing both heavily, we could disrupt those communities. We could arrest their leaders, raid their homes, break up their meetings, vilify them night after night on the evening news. And the question is whether all of the incarcerations have to do with what Ehrlichman is talking about, and I don't know the answer to that question. I don't know that there's any proof of that, but what there is proof of by Ehrlichman's statement is that there was an incentive, a political incentive, to come against certain groups of people in society more aggressively than others. And the truth is that's always the case in some form or another. And so we need to consider this again within its context, within its proper context, and not make it into something that is a reflection of all of incarcerations, but something to consider. This is a chart that helps us to understand what we've been talking about in kind of a general way. So on this side, you have a, a bar graph that shows us how people use drugs by race. So this is the bar for Black Americans, and you can see about 16% of Black Americans use drugs. A slightly higher percent of white Americans use drugs. As far as selling drugs, about the same percent of Black Americans sell drugs as white Americans. Now, over here, you have the percent of the population, of the Black population, that is arrested for drug-related crimes. And you see, this is the bar for the Black population, and you see that it is almost double the bar for the white population. Again, think back here, white population uses drugs a little bit more than Black population, but fairly even, sell drugs fairly evenly. But over here, it looks like about twice as many within the Black population being arrested. But here's the most chilling things. The most chilling part of this graph is that in drug-related incarcerations, uh, it's almost 6 times, 6.5 times more for Black Americans than white Americans. Again, as a percentage of their own populations, 6.5 times more likely to be incarcerated. And then this is on a state level. And on a federal level, you can see the disparity as well. Again, this is the Black population, this is the white population who are incarcerated for drug crimes. And so I think this tells us all we really need to know to make us understand that there's a very significant problem for us to address. So let's lay out the basic mass incarceration disparities. I've uh, put them into 7 categories. First of all, let's talk about historical facts. The truth is, the criminal justice system has been used against uh, Black Americans. There was an extensive slave patrol mechanism that kept slaves where they were, kept them from running away, punished people for behaviors, and actually some of the first policing in America were these slave patrols. There were vagrancy laws, and we know about those. If you didn't have a job, or if you weren't working, or other things like that, that you could be prosecuted and put in jail and fined, and then you could be forced to work as a convict, what we call convict leasing. And then there was this enormous apparatus of disfranchisement, of taking away basic rights, and especially the right to vote. So there are all of these parts of the criminal justice system throughout our history that have been used against Black Americans. So it shouldn't surprise us that the criminal justice system today could be skewed against Black Americans. The Black Americans could be at disadvantage within our criminal justice system. And so let's look at some specific things. Unlawful police stops. A Black person is 5 times more likely to be stopped without just cause by the police than a white person. 5 times more likely to be stopped without just cause. Drug convictions. Blacks represent 29% of those arrested and 33% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. Now, understand this. The Black population in America is about 13% of the overall population. So 13% of the people of this country are 29% of those arrested and 33% of those incarcerated for drug offenses. The prison population. In 2014, Blacks constituted 2.3 million, or 34% of the total 6.8 million correctional population. 2 things to note about that. One is that 6.8 million number is enormous. And two, again, 13% of the population represents 34% of the correctional population. 13% of the American population is 34% of the correctional population. Minority children. 1 of 3 Black boys can expect to be sentenced to prison during their lifetime. That's 1 in 6 for Latinos and 1 in 17 for whites. Killed by police. Black people are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by the police. 2.5 times more likely. One of the things I've seen many times put up on social media is people try to make the opposite argument and say twice as many white people are killed every year by the police as Black people. That's true. twice as many white people are killed every year. But white people make up a much larger percent of the population. And so that should be true. There should be 4 or 5 times as many white people killed every year. Again, as reflective of the fact that black people only are 13% of the population. So for them uh, to have as many deaths by police as they do is very significant. And then the death penalty. 35% of individuals executed under the death penalty within the last 40 years have been black. 35%. So again, 13% of the population, 35% of those executed by the state. If you don't think this is still a problem, here's some statistics on percentage of blacks on death row in a number of states. Maryland, 72% of the prisoners on death row today are black. Pennsylvania, 63%. Illinois, 63%. Alabama, 46%. Texas, 41%. Virginia, 39%. California, 36%. Florida, 36%. So we have clearly have a significant problem. These statistics clearly outline a problem. And so I want to talk for a second about what are the consequences of mass incarceration. What consequences does our society face? Do people encounter because of mass incarceration? Pope John Paul II said, we are still a long way from the time when our conscience can be certain of having done everything possible to prevent crime and to control it effectively so that it no longer does harm, and at the same time to offer those who commit crimes a way of redeeming themselves and making a positive return to society. If all those in some way involved in the problem try to develop this line of thought, perhaps humanity as a whole could take a great step forward in creating a more serene and peaceful society. I think this is an important quote. Uh, to offer to those who commit crimes a way of redeeming themselves and making a positive return to society. So we want to prevent crime, we want to control it so it doesn't harm people, but we also want to offer people who commit crimes a way of redemption and to make a positive return to society. But it requires an enormous effort, I think, as Pope John Paul II was saying. And that's the only way we can head towards a more serene and peaceful society. And we are not there yet. So, what are the consequences of mass incarceration? Um, Legal restrictions. There are numerous legal restrictions, about 50,000 legal restrictions to uh, that restrict people who have been incarcerated, that block access to jobs, housing, education, and government and private assistance. Just about everywhere you go in America, you can be restricted legally because you were formerly in prison. That is really significant to understand as a consequence of mass incarceration. Another consequence of mass incarceration is unemployment. Nearly 75% of formerly incarcerated people are still unemployed a year after their release from prison. Joblessness is the single most important predictor of recidivism, returning to prison. This is a huge problem. And if there are restrictions on employment, um, obviously that's going to add to this problem. If people come out of prison and they're restricted from getting a job, and the biggest reason anybody goes back to prison is unemployment, then we're going to have a much more significant issue on our hands, and we do. Another consequence of mass incarceration is voting. In 34 states, people on parole or probation cannot vote. So in many states, in the majority of states, if you are on parole or probation, if you've just left prison, you can't vote. In 12 states, if you're convicted of a felony in your lifetime, you are never permitted to vote again. So that's significant. We're taking a large percentage of our population and we are saying you don't get to participate anymore in the political process. And so this group not only has been incarcerated to pay the debt for their crime, they have additional debts to pay when they come out of prison. And one of those is the loss of any kind of political influence. Another consequence of mass incarceration is the effect that it has on a person's health. Former prisoners are more vulnerable to disease and premature death than the rest of society. And then lastly, there's a grave, grave consequence for the children of of those that have been incarcerated. Children of the incarcerated incur psychological strain, uh, often end up being involved in antisocial behavior, having problems in school, both educationally and behaviorally, more often than not end up living in poverty and are 6 times more likely, again, children of those incarcerated are 6 times more likely to commit a crime than the rest of the population. So as we think about the disparities within our criminal justice system and the issues of mass incarceration, that we're doing this to so many people, and that it is not balanced in as far as different races of people, different groups of people go. Uh, what reforms are necessary from a Christian perspective? Again, considering these consequences and how enormous they are, and the number of people that are being injected into this system. Um, from a Christian perspective, what reforms are necessary? What should Christians support? How should Christians view what is going on? So, again, to provide context for our conversation, um, there was a man accused of murder in 1985. His name was Anthony Ray Hinton, and when he was innocent of the murder, and when he was arrested, he said to the police detective, he said, I didn't do this. And the police detective gave Anthony Ray Hinton, at that moment, 5 reasons why he was going to be convicted for this crime. He said, 1, you're black. 2, the victim is white. 3, the prosecuting attorney will be white. 4, the judge is white. And 5, the jury will most likely be all white. Do you know what that spells? It spells conviction. Anthony Ray Hinton was convicted of murder and spent years in prison before he was exonerated and released. But this statement by the police detective, I think, is extremely important. Now, we're not saying that all Black Americans accused and convicted of a crime are innocent. That is not the case, but is also something that we need to recognize in our society, that this police detective recognized that in many parts of America, when a black man is accused of a crime, this is what is occurring. This is the situation that justice is being administered in. Uh, the uh, the accused is black, the victim is white, the prosecuting attorney is white, the judge is white, the jury will most likely all be white, and that often, more often than not, that will result in conviction, and that is a problem for us to consider. That is something for us to be thinking about within our system and to be safeguarding against. Esau McCaulley, in his book Reading While Black, said this: "We can create a society where those who are suspected of breaking the law are treated as image bearers worthy of respect. A Christian theology of policing, then, must grow out of a Christian theology of persons. This Christian theology of policing must remember that the state is only a steward or caretaker of persons. God is our creator, and he will have a word for those who attempt to mar the image of God in any person. We are being the Christians God called us to be when we remind the state of the limits of its power. I think Macaulay is saying something really profound here. Um, he's saying that people bear the image of God, and that any Christian theology of policing must keep that in mind, and it must protect all people as image bearers, even the accused, even the people that it appears have absolutely committed a crime, and it seems certain. We need to protect all people and that image that is in all people within our criminal justice system and our system of policing. Romans 13:3 says, "For rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad. Would you have no fear of the one who is in authority? Then do what is good, and you will receive his approval." This is a very important framework for us to understand. Um, Paul, in his letter to the Romans, said, "Rulers are not a terror to good conduct, but to bad." It is critically important that our criminal justice system not punish good conduct. Only bad conduct is punished by a just criminal justice system. So, a biblical view of just policing would say that just policing rewards good and punishes evil. That the punishment for evil should be reasonable, that no person or group should be pursued or punished differently than any other person or group, that the presumption of innocence is foremost. We are innocent until proven guilty, again, in a biblical view of policing, rather than guilty before proven innocent. And lastly, no person should ever be punished for a crime that they did not commit. And when you look at this list, some of the statistics and some of the information I've given you would suggest that this is not true for Black Americans, and even not true for Latinos to a different degree, but still, this biblical view of just policing, the statistics would suggest, is not the norm for our society. So, what are some Christian perspectives on the issue of criminal justice reform and mass incarceration? Well, you have really three perspectives. You have the perspective of liberal Protestants who would argue that environmental influences affect people's behavior. And so crime is as much related to the environment of the person that's committed the crime as anything else. They would also argue that there is systemic racism in America. And so the criminal justice system has within it issues of racial disparity that we need to deal with, of racial disadvantage that we need to deal with. And so they're going to argue for reforming the system and for the system to take into account the environment that the people within the system are coming out of. And so that's the liberal Protestant perspective. Now, liberal Protestants are going to also be involved extensively in prison ministry, and that's hands-on work with prisoners to help them and to encourage them and to give them spiritual guidance and to help them move forward in their lives as they have been introduced into this system and are about to ultimately be discharged from this system. Conservative Protestants, on the other hand, are going to see crime as a choice. It's a personal choice. And we need to take responsibility for our personal choices, that it's not environment that causes people to act a certain way, it's their choice. Conservatives would also argue that there's not really systemic issues. They would push back against the idea of systemic racism. All of the the statistics that I gave and all that information, conservative Protestants are going to argue that those statistics simply reflect the fact that more people in that group make the choice to commit a crime. So they would push back against systemic issues, against some of those other things that the liberal Protestants would be arguing for and talking about. And they would say there's no systemic issues. You change people's behavior and on an individual level, and you'll have a good result. And so their whole entire perspective is going to be on let's reform people's behavior. That's going to be the conclusion they're going to come to, the idea that they're going to advance as the solution. Now, interestingly, conservative Protestants also involved extensively in prison ministry. I find it really interesting that liberal and conservative Protestants, coming from two very different angles and perspectives on this question, both are going to be involved significantly in prison ministry and actually ministering directly to people in the prison population. And that would be of all races. Uh, the third perspective is that of the Roman Catholic bishops that put out a statement in 2000, the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops in 2000. They said, we really need to focus on three things. We need to focus on responsibility. You see that conservative element, that people need to be held responsible and take responsibility, be held accountable for their own actions. And then secondly, we need to have a system that rehabilitates people effectively. And so you see some of the systemic conversation here. And then lastly, and I think this is really important, we need a system that restores people. We need restoration. And I think if there's anything in our system that is terribly flawed, it's that we do not have a proper Christian system of restoration. We are incarcerating millions of people, and then when they come out, we are not giving them a legitimate path forward. We say, go to jail and pay your debt to society, and then you come out, but you have more debts to pay. And that's a really significant issue that the Catholic bishops are speaking to. I would also say that Roman Catholics also extensively involved in direct prison ministry to help and encourage and provide spiritual counseling and encouragement to prisoners. So, what specific things can be done to deal with these issues? The issues of mass incarceration, the issues of racial disparities, the consequences that we have talked about. Well, one suggested reform is to ban the box. That is the box that you check for your criminal record check for jobs. To start having a serious conversation about what jobs should people be denied access to because they were in prison. Now, obviously, there are certain jobs, depending on what you have done, that you will never be able to do again as a result of committing a crime. For example, if you're a bank teller and you stole money as a bank teller, you probably should never be allowed to work with cash again. And that probably makes some sense. But should you be denied the opportunity to work in a factory because you stole money as a teller at one point in your life? I mean, I think that's a very important question to ask. Um, Secondly, some people have suggested modifying welfare and food stamp restrictions. Um, so in many places, you can't access welfare programs. You can't get food stamps if you have been in prison. Is that really a good idea? Um, Thirdly, another reform is to create alternatives to fines for low-income defendants. One of the problems in our system is that when we fine people, so if you get a DUI and you're fined $10,000 and you're an upper middle class or wealthy person, that means nothing to you. That there are people that are fined, and this goes back to vagrancy laws and that kind of thinking. There are poor people that are fined $10,000 for a DUI that will never be able to pay that money. And this creates a spiral for people that is really, really problematic. And so we have to start to think about fines for low income defendants in a different way and punishments for people that don't have resources in a different way. Another suggestion is to decriminalize drugs. Obviously, we have problems with where we're policing and who we're policing more. But there's also the issue of, should drugs be criminalized in the first place? Should we be arresting people and putting them in prison because they have a drug problem? That is a really significant issue for us to talk about. Another suggested reform is to avoid incarceration for minor offenses, to kind of rethink why we incarcerate people on any level at any time. And then lastly, considering pardoning people who have had past drug and other minor offenses that put them in prison, and just issue pardons for people so that they no longer have to check that box. They no longer have to have that criminal record. I think this raises a really good question. Is there a point at which a person has paid their debt to society? So in this conversation on minorities and mass incarceration, we have looked at mass incarceration disparities, the consequences of mass incarceration, which are obviously significant. The disparities are significant, and they are something that we need to take a hard look at and figure out, what are we going to do as a society to fix those disparities. The consequences of mass incarceration themselves are significant, but with regard to the disparities, are really significant within the minority community, and especially the Black community. And then lastly, we've looked at the path forward, a biblical view of just policing, some Christian perspectives on criminal justice, our criminal justice system, and some suggested reforms. I would just make a general kind of concluding point here that really is something we have to consider, and that is, why are we arresting people? Why are we policing people based on their race very differently from other people? Why are some communities policed more aggressively than other communities? Some people would argue that's because those communities are more violent or more involved in illegal activity. But some of the statistics that we've shared don't prove that out. So, how do we get at that very deep systemic issue of where we police and where people end up encountering the police differently because of something about them, because they belong to a particular group? This is a very deep and significant issue that we must address. Some questions to consider. What are the moral implications of law and order politics in relation to mass incarceration? I think that gets to what I was just saying, is that we need to stop and think through uh, law and order politics as a political position, and think through the moral implications of that in relation to mass incarceration and what our society looks like, and in particular, the disparities that have been created in mass incarceration as a result. Secondly, what does the Bible have to say about the consequences of mass incarceration? When we look at those consequences, what would a biblical perspective say? How would Christians interject themselves into that, those issues and those consequences, based on an understanding of what the Bible would say about that? And then lastly, what are the moral implications of decriminalizing drugs? Is that the moral thing to do? Or is continuing on the path that we're on of criminalized drug use, is that the proper moral path? Some really good questions to consider with regard to this conversation. Thanks for joining the conversation today. God bless you, and have a great day.